Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the One Broke Actress podcast, an honest account of actor life plus a few lessons I learned in the process. I am your host, Sam Valentine, and you are currently listening to a SAG signatory podcast. Did you know that? This podcast is covered under a SAG-AFTRA contract. In fact, it helps me earn my health care and my SAG-AFTRA retirement. You can do the same thing in a different fashion with a different contract as an influencer on social media. And if you're like, I'm sorry, what? Today, we are going to break it down and talk about it. And I went to SAG and we dotted all the I's and we crossed all the T's. And I got two incredible SAG staff members to come on the podcast and talk to you about the podcast and influencer contract. And before I introduce them, I kind of want to tell you why we are talking about this specifically. SAG was made as a performers union. Anyone who was a performer. And to this day, it is a performers union. So people who perform via news channels on broadcast, dancers, radio artists, voiceover, we are all a part of SAG-AFTRA. The move toward incorporating podcasting as well as influencer content, to me, is just a perfect natural progression of performers in other categories. So today we are going to break down what these contracts are, who qualifies for them, how they are different than each other, because there's multiple different contracts, how you earn pension and healthcare through them, and what the ins and outs are of working with SAG under your own contract. This has been a huge learning curve for me, and it's opened the door to a lot of other things. And I know a lot of you make money from your own projects, whether it's through acting or whether it's through social media specifically. And your media might be a podcast, or it might be your Instagram or YouTube channel. And there are ways that anyone who is in these spaces can be with SAG-AFTRA. So today's guest, we have Sue-Ann Morrow and Shaine Griffin, both SAG staff members. Sue-Ann is the National Director of SAG-AFTRA's podcast department, and she spearheaded the establishment of the new dedicated podcast agreements and a streamlined signatory process that allows podcasters and podcast producers to easily cover their podcasts with the SAG-AFTRA contract. Sue-Ann is also the National Director of SAG-AFTRA's Department of Contract Strategic Initiatives, which identifies and engages with opportunities and challenges that arise from developments in the entertainment and advertising industries, particularly those driven by new technologies and platforms. She has over 2 decades of experience as a performer to her work. Hell yeah, Sue-Ann. And then secondly, we have Shaine Griffin. Shaine is the Manager of Contract Strategic Initiatives and Podcasts at SAG-AFTRA and comes to this work from a real passion for supporting talent and employers navigating new and emerging platforms. She spearheaded the creation of the groundbreaking SAG-AFTRA Influencer Agreement, which is so rad. If you guys did not listen to Drew Talbert's episode, go back and listen to it. She is an integral part of SAG-AFTRA's Ads Go Union commercial organizing campaign, which we love, and is thrilled to be helping podcasters build sustainable careers through SAG-AFTRA's new dedicated podcast agreements. She brings to her work experience in labor organizing, community organizing, and business affairs. These are the women very strategically behind these contracts, and they have helped so many actors get coverage for their own projects. They've helped producers cover scripted and non-scripted content, and they know so much about the ins and outs of this. So if you are curious about the other ways to go about SAG-AFTRA, about your other options, about different ways you can be covered with your union and work in lockstep with your labor union, please listen up. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy Shaine Griffin and Sue-Ann Morrow. I think the best thing to kick this off is, can I have you both identify yourselves via voice for our people who are not watching this on YouTube?
I'm Sue-Ann Morrow. I'm the National Director of Contract Strategic Initiatives and Podcasts at SAG-AFTRA.
And I'm Shaine Griffin, and I am the Manager of Contract strategic initiatives and podcasts at SAG-AFTRA.
So the reason, one, I think you're both lovely and we've hung out multiple times. So I'm just really glad that you gave me your special time of day. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to do this.
Of course. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're excited to be here.
Will you guys start off with explaining, just to anyone who isn't familiar necessarily with the union of it all, the difference between a SAG-AFTRA member and a SAG-AFTRA staff member?
Oh, that's such a good question. So the difference between SAG-AFTRA member and staff is that while our member leaders are the engine behind everything that we do at the union, and the union is its members, SAG-AFTRA staff are paid, and we do this full time, and our entire focus is the protection and support of our members. SAG-AFTRA members who volunteer on committees and on the national board and on local boards and in a myriad of ways, they are volunteers and they do that work out of the goodness of their hearts. And they have other work that they do that is the main focus of their working life. And this is something they do in addition. But at SAG-AFTRA, the staffers do this full time.
Awesome. Well, thanks for giving me some of your time. I would love to kind of get into our main talk today, because while I've done copious podcasts about being a union member and union things on different levels, I brought up to my listeners about a year ago that I was really thrilled to have signed the SAG-AFTRA Independent Podcaster Agreement and to have my podcast under a SAG-AFTRA contract. And I got so many questions. Wait, that's a thing. How do I do that? What does that mean? And then lo and behold, I also found out through this process that there's an influencer contract. And I just got so excited that SAG-AFTRA is with the times, that my union is participating in the world that we live in, the TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, podcast life of it all. So we're going to delve into that specifically today. So I'd love to kick it off with the podcast contract. Now, I know there is two different types of contracts, I believe. So Sue-Ann, do you want to kind of explain what those two contracts are?
Yeah. And I mean, I want to make the point that we've pretty much always covered podcasts at SAG-AFTRA, but we covered them previously in another department, and they were a department that mostly handles audio visual. And so we really felt that we needed to have podcast agreements that were dedicated for that space, for that audio first kind of content, where they could be signed quickly and easily, not just by podcast producers, but also by our members who are making podcasts and doing creative things through the podcast world. And that's sort of the best way to think about the way the two different contracts work. So we have the micropod agreement, which is for podcasts that aren't monetizing yet or are monetizing at a very low level. And that one was really created to allow our members to create podcast content without the pressures of a more built up agreement. There's no pension and health contributions under that agreement. No eligibility is gained by working under that agreement. It's a really easy and accessible and fast way to make sure that your podcast work that you're doing with your friends or by yourself when it's not monetized yet is covered by a SAG-AFTRA agreement in a really simple way, but it doesn't come with the same requirements that the independent podcast agreement comes with. The independent podcast agreement is for folks who are producing their own podcasts that are monetizing at a significant level. It's also for podcast producers and podcast production studios and larger companies that are making podcasts. Those are the folks that are going to sign under the independent podcast agreement. It does require pension and health contributions. It does confer eligibility. If you work under that agreement, you can join the union. And it is for projects that are monetizing at least $10,000 or more. Those are the projects that we tend to move towards the independent podcast agreement. And there's a lot of elements to the agreement that I'm sure we'll talk about, but those are the basics of the two different contracts.
And something you said earlier, Sam, is that these contracts were really built and crafted to reflect the reality of how this industry works. And I really want to emphasize that, because I think it's really important, because what you said, you have a union that is growing, it is evolving to meet performers where they're at. And the podcast agreements, the influencer agreement are perfect examples of us doing just that. I really want to underscore, they were really built for this type of work.
And I should have mentioned also, Shaine, that we have a dedicated podcast department now. And there's another staffer who isn't on with us right now, whose entire job it is to take care of podcasters and podcast producers. So the union is really taking that seriously. They're recognizing that this is a really important entertainment space and that it connects to other entertainment spaces that our members are in. And we're really excited about it. I mean, they've been very well received. It's been fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah. My first question that comes up, I'm on the independent podcasters agreement because I have income from the podcast, whether that's via advertising or Patreon or things like in and around the podcast itself. And we can kind of go into the details of that. But for the micro agreement, what are the benefits of someone signing under a micro agreement? If there's, because I think mentally we go to like pension and health, like we're working towards our health care. We're like, it should be money. So what are the other things that are included in a micro budget that is for the protection of a SAG-AFTRA member?
So we do consider podcasts jurisdictional. At a very low level of monetization and budget, the independent podcast agreement would be burdensome for some new producers and our members. But we have a lot of members who are concerned about working without a union contract in a space where they know they're supposed to be covered and they want to honor Global Rule 1. So that's the first thing that the micropod guarantees, is that you're covered under a union agreement. You know that what you're doing is the right thing by your union and your fellow members, and so you're protected that way. The other piece of it is that there are AI protections built into both of these agreements. We'll talk probably later about covering your own podcast, which is what you're doing, Sam. But in circumstances where there's an employer, even at a very low level, even just a friend of yours or a small podcasting studio where they're working at a micro level, if you have an employer and you're making content for them, it's really important to have those kinds of AI protections in your agreement and to have a union to back you if something goes sideways. So there's no use of AI technology without a conversation and consent from both the union and the performers involved. We have a steering committee of podcast performers and hosts that weighs in on all of those sorts of questions about whether or not we're going to allow someone to use AI and how they use it. And in this current environment where we know that, your content can be grabbed and used and sold and put into foundational models without your permission and things like that, the AI piece of it is super important. And that exists in both of the contracts, even though the micro is at a lower level. And there are other things like not being able to use the content somewhere else. You can't just pick up and take this content, put it somewhere else without getting consent and paying appropriate compensation to the performers that are in the podcast. In the scripted dramatic space, in particular, that can be really important. It's good to have a codified relationship with your employer. Even if you're being employed at a level where there's very little pay or even deferred pay, it's always a good idea to be in a relationship with your employer that's written down on paper in a way that is really clear and codified. And to have a union behind that, I think, is super valuable as well. You just don't want folks picking up and taking content that you helped to make and potentially doing things with it that you don't want them to do. So I think those are the major things. Am I forgetting anything, Shaine, that you can think of?
I think you did a great job covering all of that. I would just add that for folks who are self-covering their own podcast under the micropod, it's really exciting if they're a SAG-AFTRA member that they can celebrate the fact that this is a SAG-AFTRA covered project, that they are a SAG-AFTRA member working under a SAG-AFTRA agreement. I think it just elevates the production in a specific way. And I think that is really exciting. I get excited whenever I see that.
Me too. And you made me think of something else too. It's that if you're doing a scripted dramatic, very low budget podcast, you will find if you're the engine behind it and it's yours and you're producing it, but you're also in it and you're a member and you go to your friends and say, will you be in my podcast? Inevitably, there will be at least one person, if not all of the people that you want to hire, who will say, well, I'm a member of SAG-AFTRA and I don't work without a union contract. So it gives you the ability to say to your friends who you want to be a party to your project, look, I've got coverage. I've already signed the SAG-AFTRA podcast agreement. Then they don't have to worry about whether or not it's a covered project. So I think that's a big thing because folks like to work with their friends and their fellow members. And I'll also just put a pitch in for it. It takes about 5 minutes to sign the micropod agreement.
I say it's 5 minutes if you're also watching TV. Like truly, if you're going in focused, you can bang it out in 2 minutes.
I thought you were going to go in another direction. I thought you were going to be like, well, maybe 10. Actually, maybe 2. Yeah.
No, I love that. Yes. Okay. So then taking a step up from that in the heavier monetization world. And I think a lot of our actors who are listening are also often hosts of their own podcasts, of their own, like you were saying, Shaine, like they're a part of it, whether it's especially our non-scripted realm, because that's kind of the very vague area of podcasting. For the independent podcaster agreement, I will say I pay a percentage of what I make back to SAG-AFTRA, and it is then in turn given to myself the protections and pension and health credit in terms of a portion of my income. I believe it's specific based on each contract. and this is where we kind of like, it's only so many details qualify for everyone. What would be the major identifiers for a podcast that would be ready for the independent podcaster agreement versus the micro agreement?
Right. So, first of all, the other reason to sign your micro when you're not monetizing is because then you have familiarity with the union and the processes, and you're there when you start making money on your podcast. You can switch over to the independent podcast agreement in your next season. And it's super easy. It's only like an extra 5 minutes more than the micro. It's still super easy. It's the same portal.
Mm-hmm.
We'll talk about that at the end of the podcast. We'll tell you how to go and sign your podcast. If you're monetizing through Patreon, through advertising, as you mentioned, through subscriptions, you can, at a certain level, we say over $10,000 at this point. That's the policy at the moment. You should be covering your podcast under the independent podcast agreement, because you can pay contributions on your own work and also on the work of anyone else that you hire, whether they're union members or not. If they're covered under the independent podcast agreement, then they all have to be covered. Everyone in it has to get that contribution. It's 20% on top of your earnings that goes directly to the pension and health plan. If you're working with an employer, they make the pension and health contribution and they pay you, and it's separate. But if it's you and you're covering your own podcast, you have to have a corporation or an LLC, some sort of a corporate entity, in order to be covered under the independent podcast agreement. No matter what monetization you have, if you don't have a corporate entity to sign the contract, we're going to move you towards the micropod, just to get that out of the way right away. But if you do have a corp or an LLC and you're signing your podcast and you're bringing in more than $10,000 in monetization from a variety of sources, doesn't have to be from one source, can be one big supportive company that's your brand, or it can be a whole bunch of little sources of income, then it would be a good time for you to think about the independent podcast agreement, because it can help you, even if you're working in other SAG-AFTRA areas, which a lot of podcasters are. It helps you to qualify for your health insurance in a consistent way, and it helps you to build your pension, which is absolutely fantastic. There are little things around signing that, if you decide you want to sign your podcast under an independent podcast agreement, you'll come and talk to me and Shaine or our colleague Andrew Emmer, and we'll help you understand all the little nuances of how that works. But those are the sort of broad strokes of why and when you want to cover under an independent pod agreement. And again, if you're a podcasting studio, if you're a bigger employer, then that's going to be the agreement for you.
Yeah. And I'll just also add that, we look at all the various sources of income from the podcast with the person who is interested in covering their project. And we help them determine like, oh no, that actually won't qualify, or this actually is a perfect example of what will help you get to where you're trying to go. So we really work with folks. We understand there's no one size fits all, that this world is messy. It is all the things, and we are very accustomed to digging in with you. So we're
very hand-holdy present.
Yeah.
Everybody who signs on is a signatory, whether it's a performer who's a member or a producer. We're very hand-holdy with everyone.
Well, and I think that's what it needs to be. Someone told me years and years ago, hey, you should look at the SAG podcast agreement. And I was like, okay, cool. And then Shaine called me. And since then, I've been the biggest fan of it, because I had that one-on-one touch. And that is what I think is so important about you guys being here talking about attending SAG meetings, you guys, is like seeing the people behind the ideas really helps bring everything together. And it also is so nice, and we'll talk about the influencer stuff next, but it's just so nice and exciting that a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of this business is in my own hands. That I can help myself qualify for healthcare before it becomes an issue. And I can check on my contributions and I can see, oh, wow, okay, great. Well, if I didn't get a commercial this year or something like that, maybe I can invest in my business more and figure out more income for the podcast. And then I can get health insurance that way. And I could cry. Like, it is such a relief that there is something about this business that I have a little bit of control over and that is being helped along. Like, it is just, you guys, it's so great.
Well, but I think too, what you're saying is a lot of performers are looking to places where they can have a little bit more control over their work. And so the independent podcast agreement and the influencer agreement are perfect examples of how we're supporting performers who are really running their own small businesses when they're doing, their own podcast, or they're actually monetizing their influence on social media. So these were really built to support folks who are venturing into those spaces.
Yeah. And we had Drew Talbert on the podcast a couple months ago. He was great. and talked about being on the SAG influencer agreement, which I just love that as an example, because in our brains, when we all hear the word influencer, we still think, I'm going to be honest, somebody who looks like me, but like is carrying a coffee and like, oh my God, look at my OOTD or whatever. And to see the breadth of coverage that you get from something like that is so important. So I'm really glad that we talked to him. Can we speak on the influencer agreement? Because this is a whole world. I have tons of questions about this one, especially because I don't know it very well yet.
Yeah, let's dig in. Do we have 4 hours?
No, you're just going to get a lot of follow-up emails to the specific email address we will give you all at the end. When the influencer contract was developed, what was going into this process in our current landscape of having 10,000 social media platforms?
Oh my goodness, that's such a good question. So, you know, we started really digging into what was happening in influencer marketing around 2017. And we just started talking to everyone. We started talking to our members who are working in this space. We started talking to pre-members, folks who are not yet members who are working in this space. We were talking to agents. We were talking to managers. We were talking to ad agencies. We're talking to influencer agencies that are a little unique. We were talking to advertisers. We were talking to anyone who would give us the time of day, being like, what is happening here? And how can we build tools to support the performers who are working in this space that fits with this business model? Because it is very unique. It is different. And we recognize, you know, branded content in which someone is self-producing a piece of content to help promote or sell, you know, an advertising product or service. It's commercial in nature, but it's just different. So it didn't really make sense for it to always fit under the SAG-AFTRA commercials contract. We were like, let's build something unique. Let's build something that fits. And fast forward to 2021, and we launched the influencer agreement, which was so exciting. This helps, again, for folks who are working, they're monetizing their social media and they're partnering with brands and they're creating this kind of content. And by introducing the influencer agreement and influencer waiver, we're saying, A, this can be union. This is SAG-AFTRA covered commercial content, but we're going to help you do it in a way that best reflects the nature of this space. We're going to help you use these earnings to get towards your pension and health, but we're also going to make sure that the usage is contained and it's not going to migrate into other areas and you're not going to get compensated appropriately for it. So there's different ways that the influencer waiver and influencer agreement work and support talent. But what's really exciting about the influencer agreement especially is that the talent no longer has to rely on the advertiser or ad agency doing the right thing by performers and ensuring that they're putting this under a SAG-AFTRA agreement. We always want the advertiser and ad agency to do that. We are constantly trying to push people towards that. But in the event that that's not an option, the influencer agreement empowers the performer to use their business entity. So again, they need an LLC or an S Corp to be the signatory employer for the contract. And they can actually turn that project into a union project. So I just want to pause there because that's so cool, right? They're in control. They get to decide. And we handhold, we walk them through what that works. And there are certain things that need to be in the contract in order to make that transition possible. So we'll talk about what that is, but it's been really, really cool to see a lot of this work that would have been non-union become union and then help our performers, whether they're SAG-AFTRA members now or they're new SAG-AFTRA members or they're pre-SAG-AFTRA members, make sure this work's covered.
Yeah, and a big driver of creating it was that there were our members were being offered these brand deals. And because they didn't want to work without a union contract, because they recognized that it was advertising and that it had to be covered by a union contract, they were saying, look, yes, but you have to sign on as a signatory and you have to pay a contribution on the whole amount. And it was really a bridge too far for some brands, unfortunately, and some agencies. We don't love that, but it was. And so it gave performers, our members who were suffering and losing out on opportunities, the chance to take these brand deals and make them union jobs and to know that they're still doing right by their union and still getting the benefit of those contributions. So it really was driven in large part by the pain of the folks that we knew who were turning down brand deals that would really help them in the creating a sustainable livelihood. And we wanted to be able to say to them, look, we've addressed this. We found a path. Finding a path is a big thing that we talk about a lot.
So what is the difference between the waiver and the influencer waiver and the influencer agreement?
So there's a few differences. The biggest difference is that under the influencer agreement, the talent is partnering with a brand and or agency that's not signatory to the commercials contract. So they have no contractual relationship with SAG-AFTRA. In that circumstance, again, the creator is empowered to make it a union project. They go through our submission portal that's available on our website. They upload a copy of their agreement. We look at it, make sure it fits. And then once we say, yay, this fits, you're approved, they're able to make the pension and health contribution directly on a percentage of their total talent fee. And then it's a union project. So that's the influencer agreement. Under the influencer waiver, our signatory advertisers and ad agencies are actually the employer, just like under our traditional commercials contract. And they're able to work with talent who are self-producing this type of advertising content for distribution on the talent's social media and or the brand's social media and or website. That way, they're making the contributions directly. They're supporting the talent, just like on all of our other contracts. And it's a covered piece of content. So we love the influencer waiver. We love the agreement too, but we love the influencer waiver because it's what helps this industry continue to thrive, to Sue Ann's point.
And the other thing I want to say about that is like what I was just saying about the fact that the agreement was responsive to the needs of our members. The waiver was responsive to the needs of our members and also our direct signatories who were doing this kind of content, who were engaging performers to do self-generated influencer style content. And the structure of the commercials contract wasn't really quite right for it. We did need to create another structure to make it feel like they were in a level and fair field with non-signatory brands.
As a union member, do I know what all is a signatory brand and what isn't? Is there a place I find that out, or do I just have to ask? Like, how do you know that?
You should come and ask us. If when in doubt, come and ask us. But under the influencer waiver, they have to disclose that it will be covered under the terms of the influencer waiver. So that will be disclosed at some point in the process. When in doubt, read your contracts or contact us and we can help. Advice.
This is great because I think a lot of people who are listening, a lot of us have been approached by companies to say, hey, would you take this product and do a review and we'll pay you $100? And yes, but also what is the give and take of that? Do they get to use that whenever they want?
Yeah.
You know, later on in my career, are they going to bust that out on their whatever platform is popular at that time? And asking for things like a contract is not always second nature in things like social media because it's such a casual business. So setting up ramifications like this is so nice. And I think one of the most common questions you're probably going to get from folks is, in that UGC world, that user-generated content, when do you start to utilize you guys for these things? Is there like a minimum pay amount? Is it sometimes those companies just want to send product? For our SAG-AFTRA members, is there a place where they should start contacting you about this?
Yeah, so we left rates completely flexible. So we say, if you are monetizing, there are monies exchanging hands, then come to us and let's explore whether or not your contract will fit under the influencer agreement. And again, the talent does need an S Corp or an LLC. That is non-negotiable. So that's really, really important. But we have covered deals that range from literally $100 all the way to 7 figures. So we see it all. But to your point, Sam, what's in the contract really matters. And while this industry might feel casual, it's not. It's a big business. Advertisers are investing a lot of money because they know the value that talent brings. And we want to make sure that talent are reading their contracts, but understand that allowing the advertiser use in perpetuity on all platforms now known or hereafter developed is not maybe the best idea for them. So there's conversations like that that we also want to have with talent to make sure that they're protected as they navigate this space.
When I saw the influencer agreements being announced and shared, I was like, yeah, this is the next generation. This is the world. And then I went to the comments section, which is always a bad place to go. And there is a handful of people who were commenting things along the lines of, and I'm going to generalize, I've trained for years to be an actor. I worked so hard to get into my union. And now you're just going to let some girl with a ring light in her apartment join. I can speak on how complicated this business and posting on social media and things like that actually is. And so unfortunately, that to me just like belittles how hard a lot of this work is. But will you guys speak on that to our actors who feel like SAG-AFTRA is for studied intensity, long-term working actors? Can we speak to the influencer side of it all too?
Well, Shaine probably has a lot to say about this, but I'll just start by saying, SAG-AFTRA covers media professionals, and we don't just cover one kind of media professional. We don't just cover Shakespearean actors. We cover all kinds of performers and artists. It's really important to us to be reflective of the industry that we are in. We can't insist that the industry be what it was in 2000 or 1980. We have to be in the world of now. And the media industry is very much at this point a social media industry to some degree. I mean, we still have mainstream television and film. We have mainstream commercials and standard commercials. Those haven't gone away. There's still 30 and 60-second spots galore. That's a thing. But this is also a thing. And we can't ignore what's happening in our environment. And a lot of the work that we do in the Department of Contract Strategic Initiatives is thinking about these new work areas and how to make it easier for performers and also producers to cover their content under a SAG-AFTRA contract. There's a real similarity. There's a reason why we're talking about the influencer contract and Waiver and the podcast contracts in the same conversation, because they're similar. They're both new kinds of hugely popular, valuable content that is growing in an enormous way. And it was really important that we be there for that. But the main driver in both cases was our existing membership. We do want other folks to become members and to use these contracts as well. But the main driver was our own members who were doing this work anyway and wanted their union to cover the work and wanted to be protected and wanted to make sure they were doing the right thing. So I think there was a misunderstanding when the agreement first came out that it was meant to generate new membership or something, which was not at all what we were doing. There have been folks who have joined because of it, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was to make the environment safe for our existing membership, both of these environments, podcasts and influencer content, safe for our existing members and to help them to build their sustainable careers.
Safe and accessible. I'll say accessible too.
Well, and who's to say what performance matters? Who gets to be the judge of a performance? Is it only because it exists on film, not digital? Okay, is it only because it exists on your DSLR camera and not your iPhone? Is it only because it's in video form and not audio form? Like, where do you draw the line and what is a performance? And as someone who is on social media, you're not always having the best day, but sometimes it's the day that you need to share that your podcast is out and you put on a small performance to tell people you are excited about this episode. Right. And that is the business. And whose job is it to designate what a performance is? Let us live
and change and grow and do all kinds of things.
Yes. Is there anybody who you both think would be a good candidate for any of these contracts we're talking about? Somebody who we might have missed discussing necessarily? Did we forget to cover any buckets of someone?
Well, Shaine, you love talking about multi-hyphenates.
I love multi-hyphenates. I think if you are making your own content, whether it be a podcast or you are doing this type of advertising work, come talk to us because we can explore with you what might be the best option for you given the type of content you're creating. There should be no reason why we wouldn't find a way to support folks who are in these spaces that might not quite fit here, might not quite fit here. We understand that entertainment and advertising are changing, they're evolving. We're always trying to evolve with our members.
The union has too. It's really, I like to think the union has really become more flexible and more accessible for folks and really is interested in saying yes, as often as we can say yes.
When we talk about protections for people in terms of contracts, beyond just the pension and the health contributions and the AI, what do we mean by protections?
Well, I think I'd mention what I mentioned before about, again, I'd sort of hammer down on what I mentioned before about not wanting to have your content used somewhere that you haven't been compensated for. And more we are seeing content that's created for one environment being used in another environment suddenly. And we really do want to make sure that when that happens, that you get to consent and that you are paid appropriately for that reuse of your content, whether it's just your voice or it is your voice and your face. your whole body. We want to make sure that you're getting compensated. So that protection is super important. Limitations on use can also be a big thing. Jim, why don't you talk about that? Because that's more of an influencer thing than a...
Yeah, again, what Susan said, limitations on use, making sure that you're in control of how your brand is being exposed. Because, as a content creator, that's really, really important to be mindful of. And it might actually conflict you out of other opportunities if you are tied to a specific brand in ways that you didn't initially understand. You might not be able to work with their competitors moving forward. So it's really, really important to be mindful of the usage, of the ownership of the content, who has rights to the ownership, how long are you licensing, use back to the brand, where they can actually exploit that use. All of those things are really important. And that's something that we are really passionate about guiding creators specifically in navigating. So we actually put out the top 5 things that we always recommend to be in a content creator's brand deal. We released it during the strike, so it kind of got buried with everything else that was going on that was so important. But I really invite folks to look at that resource, because I think it's crucial in folks being able to actually have a baseline of what they will accept in these types of contracts.
The only other thing I want to mention is we allow under the podcast contract for host-read ads and performer-read ads to be covered under the signatory agreement for the podcast. We don't insist that you go out and this brand that's come to you and said, I want you to do a host-read ad. We don't force them to sign the commercials contract, but we force them to negotiate with you for the rate that they're going to pay you. It's freely bargained, but it's covered. And I think that's really, really important. And I think performers who are doing podcasts, even if they don't really realize yet that they have to cover their podcast or make sure that their employer is covering their podcast under a union agreement, definitely have that feeling of like, I don't think I'm supposed to be doing audio only ads without a union contract. And does that mean I have to get the brand, all the brands I'm working with to sign the commercials contract? And because we knew that's not the way this business works, and we didn't want to insert ourselves into those relationships that you're building with brands who want you to advertise on your podcast for them, we allow for the coverage of the ads under the podcast agreement. And what that means is that you really have the chance with your employer when they come to you and say, listen, we'd like you to read an ad for this company. 2 things. You get to consent and say, oh, wait a minute. No. I'm already doing a car ad over here on camera. I can't read a car ad in a safe way because you've had the chance to speak about it, but also to negotiate payment outside of what you're being paid for the podcast work, because it's in addition to your podcast work. So I'm sort of mixing together the when you're your own employer and when you have an actual employer situations. But what I really want folks to take away is that the coverage of the ads in the podcast can also be covered through the podcast agreement. And there's real safety in that as well. And it's super valuable.
Yes. For our podcasters who do guest episodes, does that mean that I've obviously have 2 gorgeous SAG staff members on with me right now, and you guys are staff and you are not SAG members. But for our podcasters who do interview styles, does that mean that everyone on their podcast has to be paid and or a SAG member?
No and no. They don't have to be. Guests do not have to be compensated if they are willing and want to waive payment. We know that a lot of guests have no interest in being paid for their appearances, and in those cases, they can waive payment. We do still want the podcast employer, whether it's you, Sam, covering your own podcast, or a major podcast studio covering the podcast, to give them a talent agreement and put that in the talent agreement so that all of the other protections are in place for them and for their voice and for all of that. But they can waive payment if they wish to do so. The reason we put it in the hands of the guest is because we do know that there are some kinds of podcasts where guests actually do want to be paid. The comedy podcasts in particular, sometimes the guests do want to be paid, and their podcast hosts want to make sure they do get paid. So we didn't want to put it in the hands of the employer. We wanted to put it in the hands of the guest, whether they want to waive payment. But we do allow for guests, only guests on shows, to waive payment.
Great. Yeah. For anyone who's listening, nobody's ever asked me to pay them. I've had a lot of SAG-AFTRA guests on here, so.
Yeah, that does seem to be mostly the norm. Mostly that is the case. So we definitely wanted to make that possible. But again, that contract is important. It's still a relationship.
Yeah. And again, it's the way that our language is built around guests being able to waive compensation when they're appearing as themselves is a reflection of what we were hearing from the industry. We're trying to reflect back what's happening and not create unnecessary roadblocks for this type of content to be created. So it's always a juggling act, a balancing act.
Well, we appreciate it. I mean, I'm a big fan. Listen, I think this is the future of this entire business, not just podcasting, but also the influencer work in general, any sort of content creation, whether it's you make your own YouTube channel or you have a popular TikTok or whatever it is, because that is this business. And the main thing that's been missing out of paying people for that business is pension and health. And to get that sort of coverage while you also have a union at your back, to me, is the only legitimate future of this business. It's the only way we come out on top and we stay in it, involved in it. For our listeners who have some sort of question for you guys, where do you want to direct them to?
Well, for podcasts, they should write to us at podcastcontracts@sagaftra.org. No hyphen between the SAG and the AFTRA. Podcast contracts at sagaftra.org.
Contracts is plural.
Yes, contracts.
Yes. It'll be in the show notes too.
Oh, good. And then for anything influencer related, you can reach out to influencer@sagaftra.org. And that is singular. That is not plural.
Curveball, you all better be listening to this podcast very intensely. We'll know if you do it wrong. You won't get a response. Anything else you guys want to add before we wrap up for today?
The thing I like to say in all of these sorts of interviews, more than anything else, is that the work that we're talking about here is the work of media professionals, and you deserve the protections of a union contract. So make sure you ask for one or create one for yourself if that's appropriate. Come to us and cover your own work if that's appropriate. But starting at the very front end, try to make sure that your employer is covering you under a union contract, because A, it's the right thing to do, but also it's the safest thing to do. More and more, you should be concerned about making sure that your employer is covering you under a safe union contract.
What Sue Ann said.
Great. So I will wrap us up. Ladies, thank you so much for your time and effort. The email addresses they listed and any articles or things they think you guys might want to see, we will drop in the show notes for you. And I am a super, super proud member of the SAG-AFTRA Independent Podcasters Agreement. If you guys have questions, you should get on this too. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Sam.